Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the Renaissance, but not the grand paintings, the famous kings, or the battles you might have heard about. Instead, we'll slow down and quietly wander through the private world of a queen. What did her mornings look like before the court was awake? How many rules and rituals shaped her every move? And what was hidden behind the silks, jewels, and portraits that made queens look so untouchable? Tonight, we'll explore the forgotten routines, the boring little details, and the unseen weight of power that made up her daily life. And before we begin, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? When we imagine a queen of the Renaissance, the first images that usually come to mind are grand portraits, richly embroidered gowns, jeweled crowns, and expressions of serene command. But behind those polished canvases lay a far more structured and monotonous reality. A queen's day was dictated almost entirely by ritual. From the moment she rose in the morning until the time she was escorted to her chambers at night, very little was spontaneous. Her mornings often began earlier than one might think, sometimes just as the first gray light entered through the tall, narrow windows of the palace. Before she was even fully awake, attendants were already moving quietly in her chambers, preparing the space for the ceremonial process of dressing. Queens were rarely allowed privacy, even at the start of the day. The act of getting out of bed, washing, and putting on her clothes was transformed into a performance of rank. Servants of different stations had assigned roles, and each was permitted to hand her specific garments depending on their rank in the hierarchy of the household. This ritual of dressing was not about efficiency, it was about symbolism. Each step, each layer of clothing, reminded everyone present of the queen's elevated position. For her, however, it could feel repetitive, even draining. Imagine beginning every day, not with a moment of silence or reflection, but with a small crowd, silently watching, waiting, and reminding you that your body was a symbol of monarchy itself. Once dressed, the queen's day did not immediately turn to matters of politics or governance. Instead, she was guided into routines of devotion. Morning prayers were expected, sometimes held privately, sometimes in small chapels, with a few members of her household present. These prayers were not just spiritual exercises. They also reinforced the queen's image as a pious figure whose authority was sanctioned by God. For a Renaissance queen, faith and politics were inseparable, and even her most personal rituals were seen through the lens of public expectation. Breakfast, if she had it, was often modest by modern standards. A light meal of bread, fruit, or watered wine might be taken in her private chambers. Unlike later centuries, where elaborate morning meals became fashionable, Renaissance queens typically ate sparingly early in the day. But even such a simple act was rarely private. Food tasters ensured that nothing was poisoned, and attendants noted her preferences and habits, recording details that seemed trivial to us but mattered in a world where appearances carried weight. After these opening rituals, the queen's mornings transitioned into audiences and meetings. Petitioners, ambassadors, and courtiers might request an audience with her. Yet even here, her role was often more symbolic than decisive. While a king or council might deliberate policy, the queen embodied the ceremonial dignity of the realm. She would listen, respond with carefully measured words, and serve as the living representation of royal order. These encounters might stretch on 4 hours, leaving little time for personal reflection. What strikes us today is how little space queens had for themselves. Every moment, from the laying out of garments to the speaking of prayers, was carefully orchestrated to project control, stability, and grandeur. The queen's body, her voice, even her daily schedule, belonged not fully to her but to the institution she represented. And yet, within these rigid boundaries, queens sometimes carved out small, hidden spaces of autonomy. A favorite book placed discreetly on a table, a brief conversation with a trusted lady-in-waiting, or the quiet comfort of embroidery work, could provide a sense of self amid the ceremonial tide. It is in these overlooked moments that we find the reality of Renaissance queenship, not in the dramatic acts of statecraft, but in the slow accumulation of routines, each charged with meaning, yet weighed down with repetition. By mid-morning, the palace was fully awake. The sounds of footsteps echoing down stone corridors, the chatter of attendants preparing chambers, and the chiming of church bells set the rhythm of the Queen's day. Her presence was often required in a variety of formal and semi-formal spaces. Small halls where ambassadors waited, galleries where courtiers gathered, or private chambers where ladies of the household sought her approval or guidance. One of the central roles of a Renaissance queen was to act as a bridge between the public and private realms of the monarchy. She was not expected to carry the weight of governance in the same way a king or his counselors did, but her voice mattered especially in areas of dynastic politics, courtly patronage, and ceremonial representation. Every conversation, even a seemingly minor one, carried significance. When she spoke kindly to a nobleman, she reinforced alliances. When she neglected to acknowledge someone, it could be taken as a subtle insult. Her words and gestures functioned like threads in the larger fabric of court politics, weaving connections that were delicate yet powerful. The Queen's apartments themselves reflected this dual role. They were designed not just for her comfort, but as spaces of semi-public performance. The outer rooms were accessible to courtiers and ambassadors, filled with tapestries, gilded furniture, and symbols of dynastic strength. These rooms projected magnificence, but they were also deliberately arranged to remind visitors of hierarchy. The deeper one moved into her suite of rooms, the more private the spaces became. Yet even her so-called private chambers were rarely private in the modern sense. Attendants and ladies-in-waiting were nearly always present. Her ladies played a crucial role in this routine. Drawn from noble families, they were more than companions. They were symbols of her status and instruments of influence. They attended to her clothing, her correspondence, and her ceremonial duties, but they also served as channels of information. Through them, news from the wider court filtered into her ears, and her wishes and opinions spread outward, sometimes softened, sometimes sharpened, depending on the listener. In many ways, the Queen's household of women functioned like a miniature court within the greater court, complete with its own hierarchies, rivalries, and ambitions. These mid-morning hours often blurred into ceremonies. A visiting ambassador might be presented with carefully chosen words of welcome. A marriage negotiation between distant nobles might require her presence as a mediator or symbolic witness. On other days, she might preside over a religious procession or oversee the presentation of a court entertainment, such as music, poetry, or drama. Each of these duties was carefully choreographed to maintain the aura of order and continuity that monarchy demanded. For the Queen herself, however, these obligations could be exhausting. They required composure, patience, and a keen awareness of how every movement was observed and interpreted. A faint smile could be read as favor. A moment of hesitation could fuel rumors. The Renaissance court was a place where appearances often mattered more than substance, and few bore that burden more constantly than the Queen. Still, within this endless display, there were small points of stability. The rituals, though rigid, created a rhythm that gave structure to her days. The repetition of audiences, ceremonies, and conversations might feel monotonous, but they also grounded her in a role that was both ancient and necessary. And occasionally, amid the repetition, a moment of genuine humanity could emerge, a kind exchange with a lady-in-waiting, a spontaneous remark that lightened the atmosphere, or a quiet glance that conveyed more than words could. As midday approached, the Queen would prepare for the main meal of the day. This, too, was rarely private. Meals were often semi-public occasions, performed with a deliberate mixture of grandeur and restraint. Tables were set with silver and fine linen, Courses were carried in with ceremony, and attendants ensured that every gesture reinforced Her Majesty. Food was not simply nourishment, it was a stage on which hierarchy was displayed. Yet here again, the Queen's role was largely one of endurance. She did not eat freely, but carefully, aware that her appetite was observed and noted. A preference for one dish might be remarked upon and even imitated. A refusal of another could stir speculation. Even at the table, her presence was symbolic, and her gestures were part of the wider performance of monarchy. Behind this steady pageant, however, the Queen remained a woman with personal tastes, thoughts, and quiet preferences. Perhaps she enjoyed a particular fruit, or took comfort in the embroidery she returned to after the meal, or cherished a letter from a distant family member. These were the threads of individuality woven into the fabric of her ceremonial life, hidden from view, yet deeply real to her. The afternoon hours in a Renaissance palace were often a blend of formal obligation and subtle retreat. After the midday meal and its accompanying ceremony, the Queen might withdraw to her more private chambers, though private in this context still meant she was surrounded by attendants, ladies, and the occasional secretary. These hours offered her an opportunity to focus on the quieter tasks of queenship, correspondence, charitable patronage, and the oversight of her household. Letters played a significant role in her daily rhythm. Written by her own hand when time permitted, or dictated to a trusted scribe, they linked her to relatives abroad, to noble families across the realm, and to religious figures whose favor or counsel was valued. The act of writing was slow and deliberate. Quills sharpened ink, carefully mixed, parchment prepared. A single letter might take an hour, not simply because of the mechanics of writing but because every word carried weight. A misplaced phrase could strain an alliance. A warm turn of expression might secure loyalty. In this sense, the Queen's letters were more than words on parchment. They were political instruments cloaked in the language of courtesy. The afternoons also allowed space for acts of patronage, which were a cornerstone of a queen's role. Painters, musicians, poets, and scholars sought her support, offering works in her honor or requesting her sponsorship. Sometimes she received small performances within her own chambers, a poet reciting verses, a musician demonstrating a new composition, or a painter unveiling a work in progress. These encounters were not only diversions, but strategic gestures, for cultural patronage reinforced the Queen's image as a civilizing force within the court. Her favor could elevate an artist's career, and through that artist, her legacy was extended beyond politics into the realm of culture. At other times, the Queen's attention turned toward matters of charity, requests for alms, petitions for intercession, and appeals for justice filtered steadily into her household. While she could not grant every request, her role as a figure of compassion meant that she was expected to respond with care. A few coins given to a poor widow, or a letter of recommendation for a struggling petitioner, might seem small in the larger scale of monarchy, but such gestures reinforced her symbolic role as the moral heart of the realm. Occasionally, the Queen sought respite in pursuits that blended duty with personal enjoyment. Embroidery was one such activity and art, both decorative and meditative. She might sit surrounded by her ladies, each of them working on fabrics destined for church, vestments, altar cloths, or ceremonial garments. The rhythm of the needle, the quiet conversation of her companions, and the gentle play of afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows created a rare moment of calm amid the constant formality. Beyond embroidery, the Queen might also spend time in gardens or enclosed courtyards within the palace grounds. These spaces, designed with careful symmetry, fountains, and fragrant herbs, offered a controlled kind of nature and ordered refuge, where she could walk, reflect, or engage in light conversation. Even these walks were not entirely free of symbolism. The sight of the Queen among the roses, or beneath the carved stone arcades, was itself a display of cultivated grace. Yet, within that display, she found something restorative. A brief reminder of the world beyond stone walls and political obligations. By late afternoon, attention often shifted again toward matters of ceremony or entertainment. A visiting noble might be received with gifts, or a small masque or pageant could be staged within the palace. These performances were both delight and diplomacy, for the themes often carried allegorical meanings, celebrating dynastic unity, prosperity, or divine favor. The queen, seated in her place of honor, was both audience and participant, her presence conferring legitimacy upon the spectacle. Still, as the light began to fade, the rhythm of duty softened. The grander events of evening awaited, but the late afternoon hours offered a subtle balance between obligation and reflection. For the queen, it was in these intervals when she wrote letters, supported artists, or walked quietly in her gardens, that her humanity most clearly emerged, woven gently into the fabric of her ceremonial life. As the day stretched into its later hours, the palace began to shift in tone. The corridors that had bustled with officials and attendants during the morning now grew quieter, their echoes softened by the waning light. Candles and oil lamps were lit in anticipation of nightfall, their flickering glow mingling with the last shafts of sunlight slipping through tall, arched windows. The queen's evening preparations often began with another round of audiences, though these were more select than those of the morning. Trusted counselors, foreign envoys, or favored courtiers might be granted a brief audience in her private withdrawing room. Unlike the formal council chamber, this space was smaller, furnished with tapestries, cushioned chairs, and carved tables inlaid with ivory or gilded detail. Conversation here was more subdued, but it remained purposeful. Matters too delicate for the full court might be discussed in these intimate gatherings, questions of dynastic marriage, delicate alliances, or the quiet exchange of favors that underpinned court politics. Once these duties concluded, the queen turned to the rituals of dressing for supper. Just as with the morning toilette, this too was an act of ceremony. Her attire for the evening was chosen carefully, often more elaborate than what she wore during the day. Silks and velvets in rich tones, deep crimson, emerald, or sapphire were favored, sometimes embroidered with gold thread or adorned with pearls. A gown's weight could be considerable, requiring several ladies-in-waiting to fasten it properly. Jewels, too, were selected with thought, not only for beauty, but for symbolism. A necklace gifted by her husband's family, earrings that displayed dynastic emblems, or a ring that hinted at alliances newly forged. The supper itself was a stage upon which power, wealth, and refinement were displayed. The queen might dine at a raised table alongside the king, or if she reigned independently, at the head of her household. Musicians played softly in the background, often lutes, viols, or the harp, their melodies weaving a gentle accompaniment to the murmur of conversation. Servants carried in dishes one after another, roasted meats, spiced fish, stewed fruits, pastries glazed with honey, and the ever-present trenchers of bread. Wine flowed freely, poured from silver flagons into goblets enameled or chased with jewels. Yet beneath the splendor, the queen was not always at liberty. Who she spoke to, what she ate, how she responded to remarks, each action was observed and interpreted. A smile given too readily, or withheld too long, could fuel speculation among courtiers eager for favor. Even her appetite was noted. Eating heartily might be read as strength, while a lighter meal might be whispered about as a sign of discontent or frailty. Thus, the act of dining was never only nourishment, it was theater, and the queen was its central figure. After the meal, entertainments often followed. A masque, a dance, or a performance of music might be arranged in the great hall. The queen's presence was expected, and though she might not always dance, her participation or her approval was vital. When she did take to the floor, it was with grace and precision. 4 courtly dances were as much about order and hierarchy as they were about enjoyment. Partners were chosen carefully, steps followed exact patterns, and every movement was layered with meaning. Later, as the entertainments wound down, the queen might retreat once more to her private apartments. These late hours offered the closest thing to solitude she could experience. Surrounded by a smaller circle of trusted ladies, she might listen to readings from devotional texts, examine accounts of the household, or enjoy quieter diversions, like music played in a subdued key. It was in these more shadowed hours that the queen's day gently bent toward rest. The night was still to come, with its own rituals and expectations. But already, as the palace settled into its evening rhythm, the queen's role shifted from the bright formality of public display toward a more contemplative, inward pace, a reminder that even in the grandeur of Renaissance courts, life moved not only by ceremony, but by the simple passage of time. As the hour drew later, the palace halls grew hushed. The torches lining the long corridors burned lower, their flames sputtering softly, and the clatter of servants carrying trays or sweeping the floors gave way to silence. Within the queen's private apartments, preparations for the night began in earnest. The act of retiring was, like everything else in her life, shaped by custom and expectation. The bed itself was a centerpiece of royal identity, often raised high on carved wooden frames, draped in heavy curtains of damask or brocade. It stood as a symbol of both wealth and dynastic continuity. For many queens, their bed was also a stage. In earlier centuries, childbirth was expected to occur before witnesses, nobles summoned to confirm that an heir had been delivered. Thus, the royal bed carried with it a weight far beyond its silken pillows. Before she could rest, however, there was yet another ceremony, the undressing. This too was not done in solitude. Attendants carefully removed the elaborate gown of separ, unfastening rows of hooks or ties, and lifting layers of skirts that had been fastened with care. Each jewel was returned to its case, each piece of fabric folded or hung for safekeeping. The queen often exchanged her heavy attire for a lighter nightgown of linen or fine cotton, simple in appearance, yet still of exquisite quality. For some queens, the nighttime hours were also when private prayers were most fervently offered. Kneeling on a cushion, she might read from a book of hours, illuminated with bright pigments. The candlelight flickering across gilded pages, prayers for health, for children, for peace, or for the safe return of absent family, were whispered in the quiet of the chamber. This nightly devotion was both a personal ritual and a public expectation. For piety was one of the pillars upon which a queen's reputation rested. The bedchamber itself was never entirely private. Guards stood outside its doors, and within, a lady-in-waiting might sleep on a smaller pallet to attend the queen should she be needed. In some courts, her chamberlain would formally wish her good night before withdrawing. This structured watchfulness reflected the truth that her life was not her own. Even sleep was subject to duty. And yet, within these confines, there were fleeting moments of humanity. Perhaps she would confide a thought to a trusted attendant, or linger longer over a letter, the words of a distant child or sibling offering comfort. Perhaps she would sip a warm spiced drink brought before bed, or hear the final strains of music fading from another part of the palace. In these small fragments of routine, one sees glimpses of the queen not as a symbol, but as a woman who bore the same need for rest and comfort as any other. By the time the curtains of her bed were drawn shut, the palace around her had grown still. The flicker of candlelight diminished, leaving only the dim glow of the hearth. Beyond the chamber walls, the rhythms of court life continued in whispers, and plans made for the following day. But for the queen, the night marked both an end and a preparation for another cycle of duties awaiting her with the dawn. Her sleep was never free of weight, for each tomorrow brought new decisions, subtle battles of influence, and the endless watchfulness of a court that never truly rested. And so, the close of one day flowed seamlessly into the anticipation of the next. Morning in a Renaissance palace rarely began with haste. For a queen, the first hours of the day were carefully managed, beginning with her rising ritual. Much like the ceremony of retiring at night, awakening was observed by attendants. A lady-in-waiting might bring a basin of fresh water for washing, sometimes infused with herbs like rosemary or lavender. The queen would cleanse her hands and face, a gesture of both hygiene and devotion. Since cleanliness carried moral undertones, clothing for the day was never chosen casually. The garments selected were meant to send subtle messages of dignity, of fertility, of dynastic pride. Colors held meaning. Deep blues and crimsons were expensive and conveyed majesty, while white might signify purity. The process of dressing could take the better part of an hour, with layers of undergarments, stiffened bodices, and outer gowns fastened with laces or jeweled clasps. Each article was not only practical, but symbolic, linking her body to the broader tapestry of statecraft. Once dressed, the queen often attended a private mass, either in her chapel or a designated space within the palace. Religion, woven tightly into daily life, provided a rhythm that punctuated every hour. Attending such services reminded all who watched that the queen was as much a guardian of faith as she was a figure of politics. Breakfast, if taken, was modest by modern standards. In many courts, it was customary to eat little in the morning, perhaps bread, fruit preserved in honey, or a warm spiced wine. Larger meals were reserved for later in the day. Yet, even the act of eating was bound by etiquette. Food was prepared by trusted kitchen staff, often tasted by others to prevent poisoning, a real concern in courts rife with intrigue. The queen's plate might be presented with ceremony, underscoring that even nourishment was a public matter. Health, too, occupied a significant place in her schedule. Physicians and herbalists were often on hand, offering tonics, checking pulses, and prescribing remedies drawn from Galenic theory. The balance of humerus blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile was thought to determine well-being. A queen might sip an infusion of mint to ease digestion, or carry pomanders, filled with cloves and ambergris, to ward off foul airs, believed to spread illness. Such practices, though to us they seem quaint or misguided, were part of the daily rhythm of Renaissance life. Between the formalities of morning prayer, clothing, and food, there existed quieter stretches of time. These might be spent in conversation with ladies-in-waiting, reading correspondence from foreign courts, or examining accounts of household management. A queen was expected not merely to preside over ceremonies, but also to oversee the immense domestic machinery of the palace: kitchens, laundries, stables, and wardrobes. Records show that some queens kept meticulous notes on expenditures, gifts, and inventories, reminding us that even the loftiest lives were tethered to paperwork. The surroundings in which she moved reinforced this atmosphere of order and spectacle. Walls hung with tapestries depicting biblical or mythological scenes insulated her chambers from the cold, while floors were strewn with rushes mixed with herbs to sweeten the air. Windows, often small and set with leaded glass, allowed filtered light, which shifted throughout the day and cast patterns across the stone walls. The palace itself was a world designed to impress, yet within it, the queen's movements were largely restricted, dictated by protocol and expectation. Even these simple beginnings to her day illustrate the peculiar blend of grandeur and constraint that defined a Renaissance queen's existence. Every action, rising, dressing, eating, was laden with meaning. In these boring routines, the immense weight of her role becomes visible, for power was not always exercised through proclamations or councils, but through the steady, ceremonial performance of daily life. As the morning hours gave way to midday, the palace stirred with greater activity. Courtiers who had been busy in offices or chambers began to assemble, and the queen's day shifted from private rituals to the more visible routines of the court. The principal meal of the day, often taken in late morning or early afternoon, was a carefully choreographed event. The queen did not simply eat. She participated in a performance of order and hierarchy. Long tables might be laid with white linen cloths, pewter or silver dishes, and cups of chased gold. Courses arrived in succession, often beginning with lighter, fair soups, stewed fruits, or eggs before progressing to roasted meats. Pies filled with game, and delicacies like sugared almonds or candied citrus imported from afar. Music frequently accompanied dining. Lutes, viols, or small choirs provided a soft background, reminding all present that this was no ordinary meal. Seating arrangements mattered greatly. Who sat closest to the queen, who was permitted at her table, and who must observe from a distance, were all subtle markers of favor and influence. Even a glance, a word, or a gesture made during the meal could shape alliances within the court. The queen herself ate sparingly. It was neither fashionable nor seemly to consume large portions, and appetite was tempered by the awareness that many eyes were upon her. More important than the food itself was the act of distribution. Portions might be sent from her table to favored courtiers, a visible sign of acknowledgement. To receive such a plate was an honor that could echo through the social fabric of the palace. Following the meal, afternoons unfolded in a mix of leisure and duty. A queen might retreat to her chambers for correspondence, dictating letters to foreign monarchs or ambassadors. The art of letter writing was not casual. Each word was weighed for tone and implication. In some courts, queens were deeply involved in matters of diplomacy, serving as mediators, offering counsel, or even guiding policy through subtle persuasion. At other times, afternoons provided an interval for cultural pursuits. Reading was a favorite pastime, though books were precious and often written in Latin, French, or Italian. Queens who were educated might engage with works of theology, poetry, or philosophy. Others sponsored translations, ensuring that the ideas of the Renaissance reached wider audiences. Patronage of the arts was itself a form of political expression, binding the queen's identity to the flourishing of culture. Recreation, too, played a role. Walks in palace gardens, accompanied by attendants, offered a brief taste of fresh air and greenery. These gardens were themselves highly designed spaces, filled with clipped hedges, fountains, and herbs arranged in careful patterns. The queen's presence there transformed the garden into a stage where beauty, order, and symbolism combined. On certain days, afternoons brought more structured entertainments, performances by musicians, displays of horsemanship, or the reading aloud of poetry. These diversions reinforced the queen's image as a cultivator of refinement and a central figure around whom the court's cultural life revolved. Even in these seemingly lighter hours, politics was never absent. Courtiers pressed petitions, noblewomen sought favor, and ambassadors observed carefully. A queen's smile or silence could shape reputations. To us, such small acts may appear trivial, but within the delicate balance of a Renaissance court, they carried real weight. As the shadows lengthened across the palace courtyards and the sun dipped lower, preparations for evening began. Yet the rhythm of the queen's day, though repetitive, was never without its undercurrent of expectation. Every meal, every stroll, every word spoken in passing contributed to the slow weaving of influence that defined her reign. Evenings in a Renaissance palace carried a different rhythm from the calm of mornings or the formality of midday. As daylight faded, the palace grew brighter inside, with torches, oil lamps, and candles lit in great number. The glow of beeswax candles preferred for their cleaner burn, and pleasant scent bathed the walls in golden light, catching the edges of tapestries and gilded frames. The scent of wax mixed with smoke and the faint aroma of herbs scattered across the rushes underfoot, creating an atmosphere both intimate and ceremonial. Supper, lighter than the midday meal, often served as a social gathering. The queen might dine in her chambers with a select company, or preside over a more formal meal in a hall. Dishes were fewer, but still carefully chosen stews, roasted, fowl, or fish, accompanied by sauces flavored with imported spices. Sweetmeats and candied fruits closed the meal, delicacies that symbolized both wealth and refinement. As with the earlier feast, who sat near the queen, who was permitted to serve her, and who received portions sent from her table carried layers of meaning. After supper, the queen's role often shifted toward entertainment. Courts of the Renaissance were alive with music and performance. Lutes, viols, flutes, and harpsichords filled the chambers with sound. At times, entire masques, lavish performances, blending dance, music, poetry, and costume were staged to honor her presence. These productions not only delighted but also reinforced the image of harmony and cultural supremacy that rulers wished to project. On quieter evenings, the diversions were simpler but no less significant. The queen might play games of chance, such as cards or dice, with her ladies-in-waiting. These were not idle pastimes alone. Games provided opportunities for conversation, for testing loyalties, and for observing the dynamics of her household. Storytelling was also common, with courtiers recounting tales, histories, or romances aloud for the company. Evening hours also provided the queen with moments to engage more privately with ambassadors or advisors. A discussion held late, away from the full gaze of the court, could shape alliances or soothe tensions. In these hushed settings, diplomacy moved forward not through grand councils, but through careful words exchanged by candlelight. The queen's presence was central to all of this. Her gestures, whether she smiled at a musician's song, asked a question of a performer, or excused herself early, shaped the tone of the entire court. For those in attendance, every act was observed, interpreted, and carried outward into the palace's endless web of rumor and report. And yet, amid the grandeur, there were still moments of ordinary humanity. A queen might tire of the music, lean back in her chair, or share a quiet word with a trusted companion. Laughter, sometimes genuine, sometimes practiced, rippled across the chamber. These glimpses, faint as they are in surviving records, remind us that even at the pinnacle of formality, a queen's evenings held sparks of warmth and fatigue alike. As the night deepened, the pace slowed once more. One by one, courtiers departed, candles were extinguished in outer halls, and only the inner circle remained near the queen. Soon, the familiar ritual of retiring began again, echoing the cycle that structured her days. But if the queen's daily life was bound by repetition and ceremony, the true weight of her existence lay in what these routines represented: the continual balancing of duty and identity, the performance of sovereignty in every gesture, and the quiet endurance of a role that allowed for little solitude. When the last of the music had faded and the courtiers had withdrawn, the queen's chamber returned to its quieter state. Yet even in these late hours, her duties had not entirely ended. A table might be set with parchment, ink, and a wax seal, prepared for correspondence that required her personal attention. Letters were not merely instruments of communication. They were acts of presence, binding her to faraway courts, distant relatives, and networks of influence that stretched across Europe. Some queens wrote in their own hands, their script careful and deliberate. Others dictated to trusted secretaries, whose task it was to capture every phrase precisely. In either case, these messages carried layers of meaning. A line of courtesy could ease tensions, while the omission of a greeting might signal displeasure. The quiet scratching of the quill against parchment echoed in the chamber, a sound that belied the weight of diplomacy it carried. When letters were finished, wax was melted and pressed with a cellophane bearing the queen's personal emblem. This small ritual reinforced the authority of her voice, even when it traveled far beyond the palace walls. Couriers would depart at dawn, carrying with them the carefully folded sheets that represented both personal and political lifelines. Prayer followed close behind. Kneeling at a small prie-dieu, the queen might linger over familiar psalms or recite prayers for her children, her husband, or the uncertain stability of her realm. These were not merely pious gestures, but also reflections of the fears and hopes that remained hidden beneath the surface of public duty. Illness, childbirth, unrest, these concerns pressed heavily upon queens, and in the stillness of night, they were given space. After prayers, attendants prepared her for bed. Curtains were drawn tight around the great frame, closing her in a cocoon of embroidered fabric. The hush of the chamber grew deeper, broken only by the occasional crackle from the hearth. One or two trusted ladies remained nearby, ready to assist if she called. For the queen, true solitude was almost unknown. Even her sleep unfolded in the presence of others. And yet, in those final moments before rest, there was perhaps a rare freedom. The masks of ceremony slipped away, if only slightly. Her hair, unbound, fell loosely over her shoulders. Her voice softened to an intimacy shared only with those within arm's reach. She might whisper a word of affection, release a sigh of weariness, or allow her thoughts to wander across the boundaries of her role. Beyond the heavy curtains of the bed, the palace remained a living organism. Guards paced the corridors, kitchens stirred faintly with preparations for the morrow, and scribes worked by candlelight to complete unfinished tasks. The queen's slumber did not halt the machinery of quartet, merely paused her role within it, and as sleep overcame her, the rhythms of her day dissolved into dreams shaped by the same symbols that marked her waking life: crowns and prayers, alliances and burdens, fleeting joys and enduring obligations. Her rest was not an escape, but another chapter in the endless cycle of duty. The night would pass, the sun would rise again, and with its light would come the repetition of ritual, the slow unfolding of another day bound to the same order, the same expectations, and the same weight of sovereignty. The daily cycle of a queen was designed to give the impression of permanence. Ritual, repetition, and order offered stability to a world where kingdoms rose and fell, where alliances shifted with unsettling speed. Yet, no routine was immune to disruption. Behind the curtains of ceremony, moments of upheaval crept in, sometimes quietly, other times with a force that changed the course of lives. One of the most profound interruptions came with childbirth. For a queen, the cradle was as significant as the crown. Dynastic continuity was not an abstract matter. It was the very foundation of her husband's legitimacy, and her own worth in the eyes of many. When she carried a child, the palace itself seemed to pause and hold its breath. Physicians consulted stars and humors, midwives prepared remedies and charms, and courtiers speculated on whether fortune would grant a son. The queen herself bore this burden in silence, retreating into confinement in the weeks before birth. Rooms were darkened, windows shuttered, and symbols of protection hung on walls and bed frames. What to an observer might appear as seclusion was in truth a ritual of both reverence and anxiety. Every sound, every stir of the attendants carried meaning. When labor began, the chamber transformed into a theater of both faith and fear, where prayers for safe delivery mingled with the muffled cries of pain. A birth could shift the balance of politics overnight. The announcement of a healthy son might send ripples of joy through the court and secure the dynasty's future, while the death of an infant, or worse, the mother, could plunge kingdoms into uncertainty. Thus, the personal became profoundly political. A queen's body was not her own. It was a vessel of destiny. Crises of state brought their own disruptions. When ambassadors arrived, bearing news of war or rebellion, the palace quickened with a different energy. The queen's role in such moments varied from consort to counselor. In some courts, she was expected to soothe, to reassure her husband and his subjects that fortune still favored them. In others, she held the pen herself, drafting letters to allies or issuing commands in her husband's absence. Even the rituals of dining or prayer might be overtaken by tension. Meals were shortened, conversation hushed. The chapel echoed with prayers, not only for peace, but for strength in the face of danger. The queen's composure mattered greatly in these hours. Her stillness could project confidence when fear threatened to unravel the court. Her words could calm factions, reminding courtiers that loyalty must outweigh doubt. Intrigues within the palace added yet another layer of interruption. Whispers of betrayal, jealousies among courtiers, or the rise of a rival faction could unsettle the careful balance she maintained. A misplaced word, an ill-timed smile, or an unguarded friendship might be enough to spark suspicion. To live within such walls was to live in constant awareness that harmony was fragile. Yet not every disruption was grim. The court also celebrated. Weddings, coronations, feasts, and festivals broke the rhythm of ordinary days with bursts of brilliance. On such occasions, the queen became a symbol of splendor itself. Draped in jewels and gowns woven with threads of gold, she processed through crowded halls where music, banners, and laughter swelled around her. These moments of spectacle reinforced the authority of monarchy, reminding subjects that power could dazzle as well as command. But even joy was measured against duty. A smile at the wrong moment, too much indulgence in dance, or even a gown deemed too elaborate might invite quiet reproach. Every disruption, whether sorrowful or celebratory, demanded careful navigation. The queen's task was not merely to endure them, but to shape them, turning unpredictability into a continuation of the crown's unbroken story. And so her life was never purely routine, nor purely chaotic. It was the weaving of the tooth, the rhythm of daily ritual threaded through with sudden interruptions of fate. Each pause, each upheaval, became another layer in the tapestry of her reign, while childbirth and palace intrigues tied the queen's body and presence to the immediacy of her court. Diplomacy stretched her influence far beyond. Queens were, by their very nature, symbols of alliance. Many had come into their new homes from foreign lands, chosen precisely because their marriage bound two dynasties together. To be a queen was to live in two worlds at once, carrying the memory of one homeland while embodying loyalty to another. Letters became one of her most powerful tools. Written in elegant script, carried across borders by couriers, they bore not just news but tone, gesture, and subtle persuasion. A queen's letter might soothe an anxious ally, encourage a wavering noble, or open the door to negotiations that her husband's harsher demands could not achieve. Her words were expected to be both tender and firm, weaving diplomacy with grace. Ambassadors often sought audiences with the queen, not only for formality, but because her manner could reveal the undercurrents of the court. A gesture of warmth or reserve, a carefully chosen word, even the length of time she allowed them in her presence, all were read as signs of where alliances stood. And in turn, she listened, absorbing reports of foreign rulers, whispers of unrest, and the movements of armies. Culture, too, became a sphere where queens wielded influence. Patronage of artists, musicians, and writers was more than personal taste, it was a statement of prestige. A queen who commissioned a tapestry depicting mythological harmony, or a musician to compose songs for the court, was not simply filling her hours with beauty. She was shaping how the dynasty would be remembered, how subjects would imagine the grandeur of their rulers. Festivals often carried her signature as well. She might design a pageant to emphasize peace after war, or a masquerade to display unity among rival nobles. Each detail, from costumes to allegories painted on sets, carried layers of meaning. What appeared to be entertainment was, in truth, a coded message of loyalty and power. Even in matters of religion, her influence stretched outward. A queen's piety could inspire her subjects, while her patronage of convents, hospitals, or schools could bind local communities to the crown. A visit to a shrine, a donation of relics, or the founding of a chapel reinforced her role as intercessor, not just between her family and God, but between her people and divine favor itself. Yet such gestures were rarely neutral. To support one religious order over another, to favor one faction of clergy, was to tilt the balance of politics in ways that could outlast her own lifetime. In this way, her quiet acts of devotion sometimes rippled outward into the realm's future conflicts. At the heart of it all, diplomacy, culture, and piety were not separate threads, but interwoven ones. A gift of books to a foreign princess was both cultural and political. A festival celebrating peace was both spectacle and policy. A prayer offered publicly in a cathedral was both spiritual act and statement of unity. The queen lived at the crossing of all these meanings, where every gesture held more than one layer, and through it all, she remained bound by the same paradox. Her life was steeped in ceremony and expectation. Yet within that rigid structure she found spaces small but significant where she could influence the fate of kingdoms. For a queen, in the Renaissance, every action was judged not only in the moment, but through the lens of how it would echo across generations. Legacy was never just about her, it was about the dynasty she represented, the children she bore, and the impression she left upon her court and her people. Chroniclers, poets, and clerics all had their pens poised, ready to frame her life into a narrative that would outlast her. A smile at the wrong feast, a word of support for a faction out of favor, or even a choice of dress on a holy day could become material for rumor or interpretation. Queens lived under the unblinking eye of posterity, though they often had little control over how they were portrayed. Some queens attempted to seize that narrative for themselves. They commissioned portraits that projected an image of serenity, piety, or majesty. Artists were instructed to soften features, highlight regalia, or include symbolic objects that spoke of fertility, wisdom, or divine favor. These portraits were sent abroad as political tools, silent yet powerful arguments of stability, beauty, and legitimacy. But a portrait could not erase whispers. Court gossip moved faster than letters. Ladies-in-waiting repeated what they overheard. Courtiers speculated on the queen's health, her temperament, or her private affections. Even the birth of a child, cause for celebration, was shadowed by speculation about whether it was strong, whether it resembled its royal father enough, whether it would live. In a time when infant mortality was tragically common, a queen bore the double grief of private loss and public scrutiny. Religion once again shaped her legacy. A devout queen might be remembered as a saintly figure, her prayers and donations spoken of long after her death. Yet too much visible piety could be wielded against her, portrayed as weakness or manipulation. Conversely, a queen less visibly devout risked censure, accused of negligence or frivolity. Her choices were always balanced on the knife edge of judgment. One way she could push back was through patronage of learning. Some queens surrounded themselves with scholars, philosophers, and humanists. By fostering translations of classical works, supporting printing presses, or sponsoring tutors for young nobles, they left intellectual legacies that shaped the future beyond the battlefield or the marriage bed. Yet even here, dangers lurked. Encouraging new learning could align her with controversial ideas, setting her against entrenched traditions. Her reputation also lived in the rituals of mourning. When a queen died, her funeral was carefully staged to emphasize certain qualities: her virtue, her role as mother of heirs, her piety. Chroniclers might emphasize her chastity, her wisdom, or her generosity, but rarely did they capture the daily burdens she carried, or the quiet resilience required to navigate years of expectation and judgment. For many Renaissance queens, reputation was a delicate balance of power and passivity. They were required to act, yet also to seem as if they acted only within the bounds of duty. To be too ambitious was to risk accusations of meddling. To withdraw was to risk invisibility. In this balancing act, each queen carved a legacy that was often more complex than the chroniclers allowed. The weight of that reputation shaped how she lived every moment, what she wore, how she spoke, when she smiled. It was not enough to live well. She had to live memorably, in a way that both her contemporaries and posterity would interpret as fitting for a queen. And so, in palaces lined with tapestries and marble, amid the flicker of candlelight on polished floors, queens carried the quiet burden of living for the present and for history at once. Behind the gilded doors and elaborate ceremonies, a Renaissance queen was also a woman with private thoughts, friendships, and fleeting moments of relief from the constant gaze of others. Yet, even these personal spaces were shaped by the demands of her public role. A queen's apartments were often described as private, but privacy in the modern sense hardly existed. Ladies-in-waiting were constantly present, helping her dress, serving her meals, attending to her correspondence. Even at night, her bedchamber was rarely empty. Attendants might sleep nearby to be available at all hours. Every movement, from the moment she rose in the morning to when she lay down at night, was observed, remembered, and sometimes reported. Still, within these constraints, queens carved out pockets of personal life. They found joy in embroidery, music, or the company of trusted companions. Some took solace in reading devotional texts, while others eagerly followed the new wave of Renaissance literature that spread through Europe, poems, romances, or philosophical essays. These small acts of leisure offered a reprieve from the rigidity of ceremonial life, even if only for a brief while. Friendships were both a comfort and a risk. A queen's ladies-in-waiting might become confidants, sharing laughter or secrets during long evenings in candlelit chambers. Yet these same women could also betray her, whether intentionally or through careless gossip. Trust was precious and rare. The wrong friendship could lead to accusations of favoritism, or worse, of undue influence in matters of state. Love, too, was complicated. A queen's marriage was almost always arranged for political alliance, not personal affection. Some queens grew to respect, even love, their husbands, while others endured coldness, infidelity, or neglect. Expressions of tenderness were often performed in public, designed to reinforce the image of marital harmony for the sake of the court and kingdom. In private, the reality could be very different. Motherhood was another deeply personal aspect that became entangled with public duty. The birth of a child was celebrated with pomp, but it was also a test of the queen's success in her role. A healthy son could strengthen her position at court. A string of daughters, miscarriages, or infant deaths could undermine her standing. Each pregnancy carried not only physical risks, but also the weight of dynastic expectation. There were also moments of subtle rebellion, ways in which a queen could assert her individuality within the confines of her role. It might be the choice of a bold jewel, a patronage of an artist or writer outside the king's circle, or a quiet refusal to bend to certain customs. These acts rarely went unnoticed, but they could shape how she was remembered by those closest to her. Even meals reflected the tension between public and private life. Banquets were grand performances, with tables heavy with silver, exotic fruits, and elaborate sugar sculptures. Yet in her private chambers, a queen might eat much more simply, savoring bread, cheese, or a piece of fruit while speaking quietly with a trusted companion. The contrast between display and reality was constant. Music often provided another escape. Lutes, harpsichords, and voices filled royal apartments, softening the rigid atmosphere of protocol. Queens sometimes learned to play or sing themselves, finding in music a rare outlet of expression that required no words. A melody in the quiet of night might offer more comfort than a dozen counselors. The deeper truth was that the line between public and private was never clear. A queen's personal joys and sorrows were always in danger of becoming public property, twisted into stories that served the ambitions of others. To live as a queen in the Renaissance was to live always in performance, yet always with a private self, trying to survive beneath the costume. If reputation was the burden and private life the fragile refuge, Then political intrigue was the battlefield on which a Renaissance queen constantly walked. She might not carry a sword or lead armies, but the stakes were just as high. Every alliance, every word spoken in council, every gesture in the presence of ambassadors could strengthen her position or undermine it. At court, intrigue was the air everyone breathed. Courtiers jockeyed for favor, nobles whispered against one another, and foreign ambassadors pressed their causes. A queen could not stand apart from this constant flux. She was too central to the image of the monarchy. Whether she wished it or not, her presence shaped the political life of the realm. Her greatest influence often lay in the art of mediation. Queens were expected to soothe tempers, reconcile rival factions, and present a picture of stability. A single word of approval, a gracious smile during a feast, or an invitation to her private apartments could tip the balance between competing nobles. Such gestures might seem small, but at a court where access was currency, they carried enormous weight. Some queens used patronage as a form of politics. By supporting certain scholars, artists, or courtiers, they could build a circle of loyal supporters. Others leaned on family connections, ensuring that their brothers, cousins, or nephews found positions of influence. Each act of patronage was carefully watched, and each choice could shift the fragile equilibrium of court politics. But intrigue was a dangerous game. A queen who appeared too active in politics risked being accused of manipulation. If she supported one faction too openly, the other might turn against her. If she intervened in matters of state, she could be painted as ambitious or overreaching. In some cases, such accusations became deadly. History records more than one queen who fell from favor or even lost her life because she was perceived as meddling too much. Yet queens could not simply withdraw. Silence or passivity also carried risks. A queen who showed no interest in the affairs of the kingdom might be dismissed as irrelevant, reducing her influence and making her vulnerable to isolation. Survival depended on walking the line between influence and restraint, between presence and discretion. Foreign affairs brought additional challenges. Ambassadors studied the queen's expressions, searching for hints of policy. A smile at the envoy of France might suggest favor toward French alliances. A kind word to the Spanish ambassador could signal the opposite. Queens became symbols of diplomacy, their gestures read as carefully as treaties. Even religious matters, already a heavy burden, were entangled with politics. To favor one religious order or patronize a particular preacher could send ripples through the kingdom, strengthening one faction and alienating another. A queen's chapel was not simply a place of prayer, it was a stage for politics. Every hymn and every sermon carrying significance. And always, beneath the surface, there was the danger of scandal. A rumor about impropriety, however unfounded, could be weaponized by enemies. A whispered accusation about secret correspondence, favoritism, or disloyalty could unravel years of careful balancing. For this reason, queens lived with constant caution. Their words were measured, their friendships scrutinized, their silences interpreted. In this atmosphere, resilience became a skill. The ability to endure slights, to smile through rumors, to absorb the pressure of politics without breaking. These were as important to a queen's survival as diplomacy or childbirth. The strongest queens were not always those with the most visible power, but those who could navigate intrigue without becoming its casualty. And yet, despite all the caution, many queens did fall. Some were set aside, imprisoned, or forced into exile. Others were remembered only through the hostile words of their enemies. To live as a queen in the Renaissance was to walk a narrow path between glory and ruin, where even the most careful steps could lead to a sudden fall. If politics tested a queen's caution and resilience, culture offered her a subtler field in which to leave a mark, unlike decrees or treaties. Artistic patronage and the shaping of courtly life seemed natural to her role, and yet their influence spread far beyond silken halls and painted chambers. Queens were arbiters of fashion. What she wore at a coronation or a banquet often rippled outward through the nobility, then into the cities, and eventually even into the households of wealthy merchants. A sleeve length, a fabric choice, a hairstyle, these details were studied and copied. In this way, a queen's wardrobe became a language, communicating wealth, refinement, and at times, even political allegiances. Choosing Italian silks over French brocades, or favoring Spanish styles over local ones, could carry quiet political weight. Tailors, embroiderers, and jewelers found steady work in supplying queens with garments that balanced majesty with modesty. Dresses were not merely clothing, they were symbolic armor. Heavy fabrics, layered skirts, stiff bodices, and elaborate jewels projected authority, while at the same time confining the queen physically. The act of dressing itself was a ritual, one that displayed wealth but also underscored the limits placed on her freedom of movement. Beyond fashion, queens influenced music, art, and literature. By commissioning works of art, they directed the themes that filled royal galleries and private chapels. Religious devotion might be expressed in illuminated manuscripts or altarpieces. Dynastic pride might appear in tapestries that depicted legendary ancestors or scenes of virtue. Each commission reinforced not only her image, but also the monarchy's narrative. Literary patronage brought its own significance. Queens supported poets and writers, encouraging works that celebrated virtue, love, or loyalty. Sometimes these writings were crafted in her honor, likening her to classical goddesses or biblical heroines. Yet behind the flattery, such works reinforced her symbolic role within the kingdom and embodiment of moral guidance, piety, or wisdom. In some courts, queens cultivated intellectual salons. Gatherings of philosophers, theologians, and artists allowed for discussion of new ideas. These circles provided queens with more than entertainment, they offered insight into the intellectual currents shaping Europe. By lending her support, she could encourage innovation, sometimes cautiously, sometimes boldly. The spread of humanist education, for example, often found its champions in queens who valued learning for their children and their courts. Even architecture bore their influence. Queens supervised the building or renovation of chapels, palaces, or gardens. These projects reflected not only personal tastes, but also dynastic prestige. A garden laid out in intricate geometric designs symbolized order and harmony. A chapel decorated with imported marble testified to wealth and devotion. Each stone, each flower bed, was a piece of political messaging. Cultural influence extended into etiquette. Queens set the standard for how nobles bowed, how they spoke at feasts, how they conducted themselves in processions. Court ritual, shaped by her presence, filtered outward into noble households and shaped the rhythms of aristocratic life across the kingdom. And yet, cultural leadership was not without risk. A queen who embraced foreign fashions too eagerly might be accused of neglecting local traditions. A patronage of avant-garde art or music could provoke criticism from conservative voices. Even the simple act of dancing at a feast, meant as a display of grace, might be judged harshly if done too frequently or with the wrong partner. Still, culture gave queens one of their most lasting legacies. While politics shifted and alliances broke, the art, music, and fashions they fostered often outlived them, shaping the memory of their reigns for centuries to come. A painting hung in a cathedral, a style of dress immortalized in portraits, or a garden still blooming decades later, all these spoke of a queen's hand in shaping the Renaissance world. If culture allowed queens to leave visible marks on their courts, faith bound them to an invisible, yet constant rhythm. Religious devotion was not merely a personal matter, it was an expected part of queenship. A queen was seen as the moral anchor of the realm, a model of piety for noble women and commoners alike. Her day often began with prayer, sometimes at a private altar within her chambers. other times in the palace chapel with attendants gathered behind her. The act was never fully private. Devotion was observed and interpreted. A bowed head or whispered rosary became a sign of virtue, and any lapse in attendance might be noted with suspicion. Patronage of religious institutions was equally important. Queens funded monasteries, convents, and hospitals, weaving themselves into the fabric of spiritual life. Such acts reflected both genuine faith and political necessity. By supporting the church, a queen strengthened her family's legitimacy and displayed alignment with the kingdom's moral authority. Pilgrimages were undertaken on occasions, sometimes to give thanks for a safe childbirth, sometimes in hopes of divine favor for a sick child or a husband at war. These journeys were both acts of humility and grand spectacles, with processions, offerings, and public prayers. The Queen's steps along dusty roads or cathedral floors symbolized the hopes of many who looked to her as intercessor before God. But devotion also carried its quiet burdens. Queens were judged on their ability to embody chastity, fidelity, and patience. A husband's infidelities might wound her deeply, yet custom required her to respond with dignity and silence. Anger risked scandal. Endurance was praised as saintly. Childbearing was perhaps the most relentless expectation. Each pregnancy carried both joy and danger. The birth of a son was celebrated as proof of dynastic strength, while the birth of a daughter might bring only polite congratulations. Miscarriages and infant deaths were whispered about, their pain borne behind closed doors, but never entirely hidden from public judgment. The cycle of expectation pressed heavily. A queen's body was not her own, but a vessel for succession. Her health, her resilience, and even her survival were matters of state concern. In portraits, she might be painted serene and radiant, but in reality, the ordeal of childbirth often left scars, both visible and unseen. Amid these private struggles, queens also shouldered the endless rituals of court life, feasts, audiences, religious festivals, and ceremonies marking every season. These events demanded composure, regardless of fatigue or grief. Even in mourning, she was expected to dress, appear, and perform her role with dignity. It was here, in the intersection of faith, duty, and endurance, that the essence of queenship revealed itself. Not through dramatic speeches or decisive battles, but through the quiet ability to endure day after day, ceremony after ceremony. These unseen burdens, often overlooked by chroniclers, shaped the heart of queenship as much as crowns or thrones. Culture and faith offered space for influence, yet they also demanded sacrifices that were rarely acknowledged. When the voices of courtiers faded, when the candlelight in palaces dimmed, what remained of the women who once bore crowns? For many queens, the answer lay not in dramatic chronicles, but in subtle legacies, quiet threads woven into the fabric of history. A queen's influence could persist through the children she raised, the alliances she secured, or the buildings she commissioned. Cathedrals bore her name in foundation stones. Hospitals stood as testaments to her compassion. Manuscripts, dedicated to her, preserved her presence long after her voice was silent. Even when political histories minimized their role, the physical traces of queenship endured in brick, parchment, and ritual. Memory was also shaped by portraiture. Artists painted queens with serene dignity, carefully arranging silks and jewels to project timeless majesty. Yet behind the painted calm, real stories lingered of a woman navigating loyalty, faith, and fragile power. Each brushstroke was both preservation and disguise, fixing her image in ways that suited dynastic pride, but concealed personal truth. Chroniclers, often men of court or clergy, recorded queens unevenly. Some were praised for piety, others criticized for influence, and still others passed almost silently into obscurity. A woman's legacy depended as much on political wins as on her own deeds. A queen who bore sons might be remembered with honor, while one who failed in that duty might be reduced to a cautionary tale. Yet memory had a way of surprising. In times of crisis, past queens were recalled as models of endurance. Their patronage of learning or charity might inspire later generations. A line in a chronicle, a surviving letter, or the walls of a convent. Still standing, these became quiet echoes that outlasted courts and crowns. And there were always contradictions. Some queens who seemed powerless in their lifetimes became celebrated centuries later, their restraint reframed as strength, their survival seen as victory. Others who held great authority were painted in darker shades, their ambition reinterpreted as menace. History, like the court itself, could be fickle. What emerges then is not a single portrait of queenship, but a mosaic, fragmented, layered, sometimes blurred. Renaissance queens lived within systems that both confined and elevated them. Their lives were measured in ceremonies, expectations, and endurance. Yet their memory stretches across centuries, reshaped again and again by those who look back. As the Renaissance faded into memory itself, the queens of that era became less visible in the public mind, overshadowed by kings, wars, and discoveries. And yet, if one looks closely in a chapel inscription, a tattered letter, or the delicate brushwork of a portrait, one still finds them, quiet presences, patient witnesses, enduring figures who remind us that history is never only about battles and treaties, but also about the women who bore its weight in silence. Among the most enduring legacies of Renaissance queens were the foundations they sponsored. Hospitals, orphanages, and convents often bore their patronage. A queen's name might be inscribed above a doorway, not for glory, but as a reminder of duty fulfilled. These institutions became quiet shelters long after the women themselves were gone. In this way, queens remained part of the lives of common people, not just the glittering courts. Education was another path through which memory endured. Some queens, particularly those with humanist leanings, surrounded themselves with scholars. They commissioned translations of classical works, supported libraries, or gathered poets in their halls. To the outside world, these acts seemed decorative, mere ornaments of rule. Yet within those gestures lay something more lasting, the shaping of ideas that outlived palaces and dynasties. There were also the letters, thousands upon thousands, written in delicate script, sealed with wax, carried across borders by riders and ships. Letters between queens and their families, queens and diplomats, queens and confessors. They may have seemed fleeting in their moment, but centuries later, historians opened them and discovered glimpses of humanity, affection for children, worry over illness, frustration with stubborn courtiers. These small fragments, tucked into archives, became one of the truest mirrors of their lives. And then there were the ceremonies. Funerals of queens were occasions of immense symbolism. Draped in black, carried by processions of clergy and nobles, their bodies were laid to rest with solemn ritual. These rites told the story of how a society wished to remember its queen, as mother of heirs, as defender of faith, as a figure of unity. Yet even here, silence lingered, for the private person remained hidden beneath layers of incense and prayer. In quieter corners, memory endured through ordinary people. Ballads sometimes mentioned queens, weaving them into folk stories. Pilgrims prayed at chapels they had founded. Farmers might pass a stone bridge, said to have been built with a queen's gift. Unlike chronicles, these memories were not polished by courtly intent. They carried the warmth of everyday remembrance, imperfect but sincere. Time, however, reshaped reputations. A queen praised in her lifetime might later be dismissed as weak, while one criticized harshly might be rediscovered as a figure of resilience. Shifting values, new scholarship, and even popular imagination all played roles in rewriting their legacies. Thus, queens lived two lives, the one they endured in their own age, and the one posterity assigned them. What is most striking is how much remains unseen. For every portrait hanging in a gallery, there are countless stories lost to laughter. At a private feast, the quiet prayers before dawn, the whispered advice given to a child. These moments, never written, are no less real. They drift at the edges of history, like faint candlelight in an empty hall. Consider Catherine de' Medici of France, a queen whose life is often told through tales of intrigue and shadow. Yet behind the grand narratives of political maneuvering lay a quieter rhythm. She rose early to hear Mass, tended to correspondence, with a diligence that filled hours each day, and worried deeply about the future of her children in a kingdom torn by religious war. Her sponsorship of festivals and ballets, innovations in court culture, gave shape to traditions that still echo faintly in modern France. Isabella of Castile, remembered for her partnership with Ferdinand, offers another glimpse into the dual role of queenship. To some, she is the monarch who helped unify Spain and sponsored voyages across the Atlantic. Yet, in her daily life, she maintained a strict routine of prayer and fasting, setting an example of piety that influenced her court. She carried the weight of rulership while still keeping the rhythm of a noblewoman's duties, sewing garments for the poor, attending to matters of household, and balancing the grandeur of monarchy with the simplicity of devotion. Mary, Queen of Scots, lived a life marked by turbulence, but even her story was shaped by ordinary rituals. Her days in captivity in England were filled with embroidery, reading, and long hours of reflection. The needlework she left behind, fragments of silk threaded with emblematic designs, speaks of resilience more than political power. In those quiet creations, she stitched her endurance into history. Queens also left their mark on architecture. Palaces often bear the imprint of a queen's taste. Galleries commissioned to display paintings. Gardens arranged for leisurely walks. Chapels built for private devotion. Though kings often received credit for these constructions, the guiding hand of queens shaped the spaces where art, politics, and daily life intersected. A garden hedge, a patterned floor, or the placement of windows, these choices whispered the presence of queens even centuries later. The Renaissance fascination with portraiture ensured that queens were captured on canvas. Yet these portraits, with their elaborate costumes and serene expressions, were rarely candid. They were statements of dynasty, of wealth, of stability. The reality behind the paint was often far more complex. Some queens disliked their portraits, feeling they failed to capture truth. Others saw them as tools, knowing that a single image could travel across Europe and secure alliances, or reassure subjects of continuity. Even music carried their influence. Queens patronized composers, invited musicians into their chambers, and sometimes played instruments themselves. A lute's melody in a candlelit room might not seem a grand act of history. Yet, in that quiet performance lay the shaping of culture, a thread in the wider tapestry of Renaissance life. Through these examples, the world of Renaissance queens becomes clearer not in sweeping gestures, but in the textures of daily existence. They were figures of ceremony and strategy, yes, but also women whose footsteps echoed in stone corridors, whose voices softened in lullabies to children, whose hands turned pages of books now fragile with age. Clothing for a queen was not merely a matter of comfort or personal choice. It was a statement woven in silk and brocade. The elaborate gowns of the Renaissance, layered and embroidered with gold thread, often weighed several pounds. A queen's appearance was a tool of diplomacy, sending messages to ambassadors and courtiers without a word being spoken. The colors she wore might signal her wealth or her piety, and every detail was calculated to maintain an image of stability. Yet behind the grandeur was a routine both tedious and painstaking. Dressing required the assistance of multiple ladies-in-waiting, and the process could last hours. Gowns had to be pinned and laced precisely, jewels carefully set in place, and hair arranged with an artistry that left little space for spontaneity. Medicine and health were constant concerns. While a king might have physicians at his beck and call, a queen often endured treatments based on the medical knowledge of the time, herbs, bleeding, or poultices of questionable value. Pregnancy, a central expectation for most queens, carried immense risks. Miscarriages, difficult births, and childbed fever were as much a part of queenship as banquets and ceremonies. To the outside world, the birth of an heir was a triumph, but in the private world of the queen, it was a moment of life and death. Queens were judged not only by their ability to govern or influence politics, but by the health and survival of their children. Their attendants played a crucial role in every aspect of life. Ladies-in-waiting, often drawn from noble families, were companions as well as assistants. They helped with dress, carried confidential letters, and served as the queen's eyes and ears within the court. These relationships could be sources of comfort or tension, depending on the personalities involved. Servants, too, moved constantly around a queen's life: maids, pages, musicians, scribes, and chaplains. Their unseen labor ensured the smooth running of a household that might seem effortless from the outside. The trust a queen placed in her attendants could determine how much privacy she truly possessed in a world where little was hidden. The queen's influence was also felt in matters of food. Banquets might showcase her wealth, but her personal meals revealed another story. While kings often indulged in feasts, queens sometimes followed stricter diets, both for health and for appearance. They might fast during religious observances, or eat lighter meals to maintain composure during long audiences. Kitchens designed menus according to seasonal availability, meaning a queen's table could look quite different in winter than in summer. Exotic fruits and spices imported from abroad were prized luxuries, yet even these were woven into the rhythms of everyday nourishment. Education was another sphere in which queens left their mark. Many Renaissance queens were literate and fluent in multiple languages, a skill that allowed them to correspond across Europe and shape diplomacy. Their libraries contained devotional texts, histories, and sometimes works of philosophy. Reading was both a duty and a refuge, moments stolen in private chambers, where a queen could immerse herself in words rather than ceremony. Some became patrons of writers and scholars, ensuring that their courts thrived not only in politics, but in learning. In these ways, the queen's life in the Renaissance was defined less by single dramatic events, and more by the slow accumulation of details. Her footsteps down echoing corridors, her patience in hours-long ceremonies, her quiet words to a confidant, the letters she signed with Carol, formed the mosaic of queenship. And as we draw closer to the quiet close of this section, one wonders, when history remembers a queen, does it capture her as she truly lived in the measured details of each day, or only as the figure painted in portraits and written in chronicles? Religion was never far from a queen's life. In the Renaissance world, where faith underpinned law, politics, and daily rhythm, a queen's devotion was both personal and public. She attended Mass regularly, observed fasts, and participated in elaborate religious festivals. Chapels within palaces often bore her mark, commissioned to reflect her piety and presence. Yet prayer was not only a display for others, it was also one of the few moments of genuine solitude. In candlelit chapels, queens might whisper private fears or seek strength for duties that weighed heavier than their crowns. The arts, too, were shaped by queens. Some sponsored painters, musicians, or architects whose work still echoes today. Others influenced fashion and taste across entire courts. What a queen wore could ripple outward, until noble families across a kingdom sought to imitate her style. A necklace, a particular cut of fabric, or even the way she styled her hair might become a trend, silently binding her subjects together in shared imitation. Beyond these visible influences lay something quieter, the queen's role as a stabilizing figure. At times when kingdoms faced rebellion, famine, or war, the queen was often presented to the people as a symbol of endurance. Her presence on balconies during festivals or in processions reassured subjects that continuity was possible, even in uncertainty. Though she might not command armies directly, her mere image could calm or inspire. Yet the contradictions of queenship remained. While queens lived surrounded by finery, they rarely enjoyed true freedom. Every gesture, every friendship, every word was scrutinized. A misstep could become rumor, a rumor could become scandal, and scandal could shift the balance of power. To be queen was to inhabit a life of ceremony and ritual, where even silence had meaning. In the quieter moments, freeing by lamplight, stitching embroidery, or walking in gardens, the queen may have wondered how history would remember her. Would it be as a mother of heirs, as a patron of art, or merely as the wife of a king? Or would the countless small details, the hours of prayer, the meals carefully eaten, the letters penned and sealed fade away, leaving only the broad strokes of dynastic politics? As our journey through her daily life comes to a close, the image of the Renaissance queen becomes less a figure of myth and more a human presence, a woman balancing duty and desire, ritual and reality, splendor and solitude. And perhaps the lingering question is this: when we think of queens of the past, do we truly see their lives, or only the crowns that sat upon their heads? And so, as we leave the echoing corridors of Renaissance palaces behind, the picture of a queen feels less like a distant legend, and more like a series of quiet moments stitched together across time. The carefully pinned gowns, the slow ritual of prayer, the long hours spent listening, watching, and waiting, all reveal that queenship was not only about crowns and portraits, but about patience, endurance, and presence. When you think back on these women, perhaps you'll remember not just their names in history books, but the small, almost forgotten rhythms of their days, the creak of a chamber door at dawn, the soft whisper of silk trailing across stone floors, the flicker of a candle at night as they read or wrote in silence. These details remind us that behind the grandeur of the Renaissance lay human lives shaped as much by boredom and routine as by splendor and ceremony. And in that realization lies a kind of comfort, that history, even in its most magnificent chapters, was lived one quiet day at a time. Now, as you drift into rest, let the world of the Renaissance fade slowly, like candlelight dimming in a quiet hall. Breathe deeply, and allow the weight of history to soften into stillness. And when you wake again, we'll continue together, with another story, this time moving into a new corner of history, one just as filled with quiet details and surprising textures. A different time, a different place, but the same slow journey through the overlooked corners of the past. For now, close your eyes, let the voices of the past fade into silence, and rest well. Tomorrow, another tale awaits.